I am enormously pleased to be able to welcome Texas Railroad Commissioner Michael Williams to the College of Liberal Arts today. Commissioner Williams earned a bachelor's, a master's, and a law degree from the University of Southern California, not far from where I was born, as we were discussing, and not far from where I had a family member playing football. And though this has perhaps led to some degree of conflict during recent weeks, but we'll leave that alone. He was initially appointed to the Texas Railroad Commission by then Governor George W. Bush in December of 1988, and subsequently chaired that body for 4 years between 1999 and 2003. He has been twice elected to the commission by the voters of Texas, and he is, frankly, a historic figure. He is the first African American in Texas history to hold an executive statewide post, and at this moment is the highest ranking African American in the Texas state government. You know, I really leapt at the opportunity to invite Commissioner Williams to campus, you know, in part, I confess, because I've seen him give rousing political addresses on a couple of occasions. I'm happy and very interested to have him here to talk primarily about policy, specifically the role of coal and other forms of energy in Texas' future. But in our chat right now, he also graciously agreed to take questions afterwards in any and all topics, and having chatted with him a little bit, I hope you'll take him up on that, because if you won't, I will. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Railroad Commissioner Michael Williams. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to visit with you, and I thank you for the introduction. And Dean, it's good to be with you, Professor Roberts, and Gwen, thank you. Thanks for not only the invitation, but also for all the work you've been doing with us on a very, very important project that I'm engaged in right now. You've already seen I'm a little bit different. You know, I tell people I wouldn't stand behind something like this unless I thought you were going to shoot at me, and we ought to be fairly safe right now. I'm an old litigator, so I like to get close to my jury, and so that's what I'm going to attempt to do. Look, you know, I've been asked to sort of talk about energy issues, but if you don't mind, let me just spend a fair amount of time talking about energy, and as I mentioned to Jim, I hope you will take me up on the invitation to ask me whatever about politics or policy that may sort of cross your mind. You know, one of the things I do, though, that is sort of customary, and I've done it in the 7 years that I've been a commissioner, is not only sort of thank folks for the invitation, but sort of thank you, because the people of Texas were kind enough in 2000 and then in 2002 to elect a bald-head guy that wears bow ties and cowboy boots and send me to the Railroad Commission of Texas, and so I thank you. And if you weren't part of that group, don't worry about it. In about 2008, you'll get another chance. So, you know, but the other thing is that there is a person who made it possible, as was mentioned, for me to be a member of the commission in the first place, and that's the person who appointed me. He used to be our governor, who's now our president, and that's President Bush. And the interesting thing is that the president and I have known each other for a fairly long time. It goes back to when we were members of the United Way of Midland together back in 1980. And even though I have now run for statewide office twice, the first time I ran for political office was in 1984. I ran for county attorney in my hometown of Midland, Texas. And I had a good campaign manager. His name was George W. Bush. And we got absolutely clobbered in the Republican primary. So then I went off and worked for President Reagan and then the first President Bush. And so I continue to thank my good friend for giving me the opportunity to serve you and be on that strangely named thing called the Railroad Commission of Texas. I know somebody's going to ask me, so let me get out of the way. What do you do, and why is it called the Railroad Commission? First of all, I had nothing to do with railroads. We have 800 employees, no really, we have 800 employees at the Railroad Commission of Texas. And at the last legislative session, we had 24 that dealt with railroads. They dealt with safety, where there's a crossing guard and an electronic warning device. And so we asked the legislature, because we want to create and expand and enhance upon what we believe is the premier state energy policy agency in the country, we wanted to enhance upon that. So we said, look, move the rail division from the Texas Railroad Commission to Texas Department of Transportation. There's some other energy-related activities elsewhere in state government. Move that to the Railroad Commission of Texas. And oh, by the way, change the name. And the legislature did a lot of what we asked. They moved the 24 employees to the Texas Department of Transportation. They moved some of the energy-related activities that we had identified to the Railroad Commission of Texas. And they said, oh, by the way, we're not changing the name. At your government at work. And so today I have absolutely nothing to do with railroads, but we're still called the Railroad Commission of Texas. You know, obviously it's a name that goes back 100+ years and back to the point when crude was actually transported by rail, but that's not the case today. And as you know today, what we do primarily is we're engaged in the regulation of oil and gas production, mining, predominantly coal, some uranium mining, pipelines. We have the largest smorgasbord of pipelines of any state in the country. 280,000 miles of pipe run underneath Texas. And in addition to that, the fossil fuel directed alternative fuels such as LPG, CNG, and LNG. So that's basically the jurisdiction. What I want to do is spend some time talking about what I think are sort of the big energy challenges that we have in the country. And I think they relate to electricity on the one side, transportation on the other. Most of the time when people think about sort of energy, everybody gets focused on oil, and particularly I guess today, where oil is $72 a barrel, which is kind of strange. When I was sworn in 7 years ago, oil was $12.42 a barrel. And I remember I had a conversation shortly, it had to have been 2 months after I had been a commissioner. I had a conversation with, at that time, he was Sir John Brown, CEO and chairman of the board of BP. He's now Lord John Brown. And I asked Sir John Brown, I said, what can you tell me about what I should expect for my career as a railroad commissioner, however long it will be? He said, constant and volatile change. You know, you think about 7 years ago, crude was at $12.40 some odd cents a barrel. You think about at that period of time, nobody thought about China as a large consumer of crude oil. We actually every year have something at the Railroad Commission of Texas that we call the State of Industry. We invite all of the players in the oil and gas industry and other energy related activities around the state to come to the commission, talk to us about what they think is important. And at that time, crude oil prices were enormously low and the room was packed. And we had operators, one after the other, come up in front of the three commissioners and just lambast commissioners about why prices were so low, and they wanted us to go out and sue the Venezuelans and sue the Saudis for dumping crude on the market, all kinds of things. And former railroad commissioner and former Congressman Ken Hans came up and he said, why don't you guys leave these commissioners alone? What you really need to do, quit fussing at them, go to China and see if you can urge the Chinese to quit riding bicycles and buy cars. Well, it didn't happen exactly like that, but that's exactly what happened. Just last, Chinese were using about 3 million barrels of crude a day. Today, they consume about 6 million barrels of crude, and just in '04 alone, they increased 1 million barrels of crude in 1 year. That was a 19% increase in Chinese consumption in '04. That's 40% of the global increase in consumption of crude, the new increase in consumption of crude, driven by one country that has enormous opportunity because of its population for increased demand. But in terms of the challenge that we have, I think it really comes down to what we're doing in electricity and what happens in transportation fuel. So the electricity side, most of us typically don't think about the energy demand from electricity. But if you think about across the realm there, 40% of our energy demand goes to the generation of electricity. Only 30% of U.S. demand of energy goes for the consumption of transportation fuels and another 30% for heat. And when you look at that 40%, that's electricity. The interesting thing that we see, demand's going to increase. Because what do? You got a DVD? Yeah, you know you got DVD. You got DVD and a CD and microwave and BBDs. Well, that's something else. But that's something else. But that doesn't plug up. But anyway, you got all that stuff that we plug up that's burning up electricity. And now today, when we look at across the country, 50% of the electricity we generate in the country comes from coal. About 30-some-odd% comes from, well, nationally, about 25% comes from natural gas. Nukes take up another anywhere from 8 to 10. And then fuel oil, and then the renewable sustainables do the balance. In Texas, we've got it somewhat flipped because for us, about 50+% of our electricity is generated from natural gas and about 38% of it's coal. So we've got it flipped from what is happening nationally. But you know what the challenges are if you think about 50% of electricity nationally comes from coal. What's the big challenge? Folks think it's dirty. It's all that junk that goes up, all the emissions. And so we've got to figure out a way, quite frankly, to continue to use coal. Because we can make electricity cheaper using coal than we can with natural gas and fuel oil. And right now it's a whole lot more efficient than wind and solar. So we've got to use coal, and we want to use it for another reason. We in the US, we're the Saudi Arabia of coal. We've got a 250-year supply of coal at today's levels of consumption. We got a bunch of coal. So we need to figure out a way to use it. One of the things that I've been doing and been engaged in since 2003, when Governor Perry named me the chairman of the state's Clean Coal Technology Council, is to try to figure out ways that we can use coal and use it cheap, use it not only cheap, but clean. And we're engaged now in a competitive process to win a grant called FutureGen. It's a federal grant. It's $1 billion. $750 million coming from the federal government, $250 million coming from a consortium of private companies to build the first near zero emissions power plant in the world using coal. Now, I realize when I say clean and coal, you probably say those two words don't collide in the same sentence, but they do. And what it is, it's a different way of using coal to make electricity. Currently what we do is we take the coal, and you've seen little bricks of coal, and we pulverize them and beat them up, then burn it. And what happens? You get nitric oxide, sulfurs, particulates, maybe mercury, CO2, other stuff emitting to the air. But then we try to capture it in some kind of way with scrubbers and other technology so that in Dallas and Fort Worth non-attainment areas, or even near non-attainment areas like this, we don't continue emitting emissions. This process that we'll be using in FutureGen is called gasification. It's a chemical process. And it takes the nitric oxide and the sulfur and the mercury out of the coal before it's burned. And that process then creates a synthetic gas that's rich in hydrogen. And it's that synthetic gas with all the other stuff already pulled from it that will be burned to make the electricity. Now, some folks are also concerned about CO2, right? Because we've been told, whether we believe it or not, some of us believe it, some of us don't. I'm not sure, I'll tell you right now. I'm not sure about global warming, but, some of us are concerned, well, what's gonna happen if the CO2 continues to go into the air? And so one of the things that this project is going to test is not just simply can you take out the sulfur and the nitric oxides and the particulates out of the coal before you burn it. Can you take the CO2 and store it? Put it underground and permanently store it. And so that's the other big feature of FutureGen, is to take that CO2 and put it in the ground and store it. I'm happy to say, Gwen, that we've identified 2 sites in Texas where we're going to propose that the FutureGen Alliance builds that plant in Texas. One of them's out in West Texas, near Odessa. One of them is in East Texas. I'm calling it Central East Texas, near the Jewett. It's in Leon County, but it's at the mouth of one of our lignite mines in Jewett. But in the Odessa site, we had to figure out where to inject that CO2. And the University of Texas, you own all that land out there that's to benefit the PUF fund. And we're in the middle of negotiations that look very, very well right now for us to partner with the university so that we can inject that CO2 that's required in this project on university lands. And so I thank you again for all of your help in arranging for those conversations. But that's part of it. The other thing that's interesting about FutureGen is that we've got aging oil fields in the state. And you can use CO2 to bring new life to aging oil fields, oil reserves. Today in the country, in West Texas, in the Permian Basin, we lead North America and enhanced oil recovery using CO2. And so this CO2 now can also provide new life so we can bring up new barrels of crude. Now, that's on the electricity side, but what about the transportation side? I think all of us are probably getting a little nervous about where gasoline prices are going. I know I am. I have to drive, my wife and I maintain a home in Arlington, but by law I have to live here. So I vote here. Let me look in the camera. I vote here. My driver's license says here, and I have an apartment here, but the wife is in Arlington. So I make that drive every week. So I know how much gasoline is, you know, and I recognize the increase in gasoline prices. And what's interesting is about 66% of the crude we consume in the country right now goes for transportation fuels. Another 25% goes for industrial purposes, and you know, we've got about 6.5% of the next goes for the generation of heat for residential and commercial customers, and then only about 2% is used for electricity. So what do we do about crude? Because we've got some challenges. We got some challenges because some people believe that, let's say the threats are, some people believe that we are either there or approaching sort of the peak production of inexpensive conventional crude. We also know that crude is susceptible to international political challenges, whether they be what's happening in Iran, Iraq, Sudan, or Venezuela. Since Chavez says if we attack him, he just said this just recently, we attack him, he'll blow up the oil fields. Same thing Saddam Hussein said. But it still, there are those political issues, that international political issues that can impact crude. We just learned through Hurricane Katrina and Rita that obviously crude oil production and our gasoline is subject to natural issues as well, hurricanes and things of that nature. And then we've got sort of what I mentioned that sort of earlier, the competition that we in the U.S. today have with emerging economic powers such as China and India and their consumption of crude and their prospect for increased sort of consumption. And I think there's sort of three things that we can do. Obviously, a couple things we can do. First of all, we got to produce more crude here domestically. And the second, it's going to be a question of using, you know, advanced technology and doing some research and development. But we can move from that thing called coal again, not just from coal to make heat or coal to make clean electricity, but coal to make transportation fuels. And you think about it, well, how in the world are you going to get a coal into a liquid form that I can put into my car? And one of the things that we can do is just follow the lead of South Africa. You know, at the point of several decades ago when many countries around the world were not trading with and not dealing with the country of South Africa because of apartheid, and countries would not sell crude to the South African government. South Africa said, well, what is it that we have that we can use that we can make fuel? And it was coal. And they developed the coal to liquids technology. And right now, about 25% of their transportation fuels in South Africa come from coal. And so that is one of the things that obviously I think is helpful for us, and it just happens to be that coal to liquid fuels is a whole lot cleaner than the gasoline that we are burning today. The coal to liquid fuel that South Africa burns today is cleaner than the gasoline that we burn. In addition to just producing more crude here, moving from coal to liquids technologies, I think it'd also be helpful for us, obviously, to look at what we can do in terms of production of crude and oil shales, and then, of course, move to the biomasses. You know, those corns and switchgrasses and wood chips. That's going to require an enormous amount of sort of technological development for us to be in a position to do that. So those are sort of what I think the energy challenges are for us, and what some of those answers might be. And we'll continue to see what we can do to move the country down the road to get there. I'm excited about what we now have on the plate in terms of FutureGen. And while we intend to win FutureGen, I also think it's important that even if we don't, I'm promoting things that we call FutureGen-like. There are any number. We went through a competition in the state to try to find the best site in Texas. And we had 14 possible sites, and we whittled it down to just 2. But even those other 12 sites, you could have smaller FutureGen-like facilities on those locations. One may just have a gasifier and produce that hydrogen-rich natural gas that can be used to make electricity. So another one may decide to have the gasifier, and so they can produce the CO2 that can be used for enhanced oil recovery because it's located near aging oil fields. But there are a lot of different ways that I think we can use the sort of the FutureGen-like opportunities around the state to enhance the sort of our energy opportunities. Let me stop there. Let you ask whatever you may desire to as it relates to energy, politics, or policy. And let me get this out of the way first. Okay, you mentioned it. I should have, and it is belatedly, it's now, okay, 25 minutes. Let me congratulate the Longhorns on winning a national championship. It was painful. That's all right. And if you ask me, was I conflicted? I was not conflicted, not at all. I was born in Texas, raised in Texas, but I spent 7 years at Southern Cal, 3 degrees. I'm a Trojan. I understand. You got to forgive me, okay? Go ahead, yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Well, it's a chemical process, and so what ends up happening, and you know, I'm not the chemist, but let me give you the non-chemist lawyer explanation. What happens through gasification is a process is a combination of fluids, mostly water, temperature, and pressure. And what it does is make different combinations. And so what's there combines to make synthetic gas, combines to make CO2. And the only thing that really is left is a slag of sort of small amounts of basically sulfur. And that sulfur we can then treat as we do other sulfur and waste. You can sell it. But what ends up happening through this chemical process, you create other kinds of chemicals, namely this hydrogen-rich gas and the CO2, which you now have to store and sequester. But that's what happens with it. Well, I mean, that's part of the test. I mean, that's part of the test. And we would argue with you that no. Think about what we do. Every year in the Permian Basin, we inject 20 million tons of CO2 in the Permian Basin every year for enhanced oil recovery. This project in FutureGen is to inject 1 million tons. So this is what we do right now is a magnitude of 20 to 1 more what we do right now. Now, admittedly, in the CO2 EOR that we do in West Texas, we put the CO2 in the ground, crude oil comes up, you separate the crude and the CO2, you put the CO2 back in the ground. So it's not designed to stay there. This is designed to stay there permanently. But God has been real good to Texas. We have, obviously, formations in Texas, not only where we took crude oil and natural gas out of that kept the CO2 and natural gas naturally from moving other places, that you can put the CO2 back in. And so the idea in this one is to take salt formations where they have large, thick, and this is about 8,000 feet. And so in the project, obviously it's below usable quality water. So where you're injecting the CO2, there's no water down there. There's nothing that we're using down there. And then there is a cap. It just so happens out in the Odessa side, there is a salt cap of several hundred feet above. And it just so happens a salt cap of several hundred feet below and a large wall of several hundred feet on the sides. And this is going to be injected in there. There's no real likelihood it's going to come out, but one of the things that we're required to do is have measuring, monitoring, and verification equipment on the surface to make sure that none of this stuff comes out. That's part of the test. Our favorite, and I think for a couple reasons. I mean, we would have, if the bill had not been vetoed by former President Clinton in '97, we'd be able to produce about 1.5 million barrels of crude out of the ANWR. And if we were producing 1.5 million barrels of crude, obviously that's 1.5 million barrels of new supply. And that new supply would be extremely helpful right now, as we recognize that the Saudis have been telling us for some period of time that if they needed to, that they could produce more crude in Saudi fields. And now we realize that we're at these $72 barrels that they can't turn the spigot back on. They're at maximum capacity or very near maximum capacity right now. I know some people have been concerned about what's the impact environmentally production. We've been producing in Alaska for some period of time without environmental questions. And the footprint of today's production is much smaller than the footprint, sometime before. And in addition to that, the caribou don't mind. The caribou, doing just fine up in Alaska next to those oil fields, those wells and those pipes. It's an environmental project. The real purpose for FutureGen is twofold. It's to recognize that we have to continue to use coal to make electricity in the country because of the large dominance of utilization of coal, particularly nationwide, and even for us in Texas because it's such a large part of our economy. The reason that, irrespective of how expensive you think your electricity charges are, the reason that our electricity charges generally run much cheaper than our counterparts elsewhere is because we have two fuels, natural gas and coal, that we don't have to get from anybody else. But beyond just using the coal to make electricity, as I said, there's a twin goal, and that other goal is environmental. We've got to make sure that we don't continue to use coal in a way that emits mercury into the air, that emits sulfur and nitric oxides and VOx into the air. And so that's what this is. And we know that you can remove those matters. Eastman Kodak, now Eastman Chemicals, but when it was Eastman Kodak, they had been using gasification to remove mercury from coal through their gasifier because they recognized that when they were making film, mercury had some way of ruining film. And so they learned 25, 30 years ago to remove the mercury through a gasifier. We also know that we can remove the other matters through gasification, what we've never done before. So I mean, the country has an experience in using coal gasification to remove those products. The country has an experience, as I mentioned earlier, in using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. The country has some experience in burning synthetic gas to make electricity. We've never done all of them at the same time. But the environmental piece is the large piece to the FutureGen sort of vision. And I think in terms of the continuum, starting from where we are now, and looking on the transportation side, as opposed to the electricity side, looking on the transportation side, we have obviously gasoline for the most part. We have what I will call the fossil fuel directed alternatives such as LPG and CNG. And then as you look at, I think, sort of coal to liquids, and I think hydrogen is probably out sometime. I realize the president has said that he'd like for us to be able to drive around in our Jetson hydrogen fuel cars by 2025, and we may or may not get there. But we'll have to figure out some kind of way to commercially make the hydrogen. Interesting thing, coal gasification gives us a way to create the hydrogen that will be needed for that hydrogen economy. I think we'll eventually get there. But in the meantime, I think the transition, and part of that transition is going to be things sort of like coal liquids in the meantime. Not only see, but have urged. We are, Texas, we're the energy capital of the country. And when you think about the resources that we have, not only do we have natural resources, whether it be crude and natural gas and coal, but we also have sort of the brain power. And of course, we need a whole lot more of that scientific and technologically based brain power in the state. But it seems to me that while many of us would have urged the administration to sort of follow the lead of a New York Times writer and sort of, declare that we were going to sort of set out and try our best to, sort of solve the energy issue, particularly as it relates to transportation fuels, by some period of time and sort of set the entire country on that course. That has not happened yet. Perhaps the leading energy producing state in the country can do that. And one of the things I think several of us have thought about, in light of the fact that the state now seems to be in the position where it enjoys an $8 billion surplus, which does mean the government took more of your money than it needed. But there's an $8 billion surplus. If it were to spend some of that on something and to invest some of that into something, it may be, I think, extremely helpful to invest it in terms of energy research and development, so that we can, because we as a country and as a state, we cannot continue, particularly on the transportation side, to allow ourselves to stay tied to crude oil for transportation. That is not going to be healthy for our national economic interests in the future. And we're going to have to, I think, in a hurried way, get prepared to sort of move to sort of the next, whether it's hydrogen or whether it is those fuels that I will call sort of bridges, if you will, to that hydrogen economy. We need to move in a hurried way to that next level. Well, when I was, I've had the occasion to sort of teach on 3 or 4 different occasions, an adjunct to teach a graduate level public policy course. And, we always try to talk about sort of policy agenda streams. I don't think there's an agenda stream right now that allows one to have this conversation in a way that is going to sort of end in the result of doing this. So I think, because right now everything is focused on what we're going to do about property tax on narrower issues, not this sort of large new kind of issue. It's what are we going to do about property taxes, and if so, what are we going to later? Then what if anything are we going to do about new money to schools? But it is an opportunity for us to have a conversation, and I think most new issues you have to have the conversation with the legislature on several occasions before they actually win, and so that's why in presentations before energy committees, natural resource committees, it's important for me to continue to urge the fact that we need to be putting energy in the research and development demonstration, that we need to not only try to win FutureGen, but win other kinds of large energy-related competitive projects such as FutureGen. But we're not going to win it in January of '07. Hopefully we can win it in January of '09 or maybe January 11. But the optimist that I am even recognizes that I don't think that I can win that one in January of '07. As it relates, there was all of the states who were interested in putting forth responses were asked to give their notice of intent to submit several weeks ago. And 9 states raised their hand and said, look, we think that we want to participate in this FutureGen project. But of those 9 states, there were combined 22 different sites. And we have yet to submit our responses, and we'll submit it on May 4th. And we've already made a determination we're going to submit too. But I would imagine there are going to be several states that will submit too, and that's because the RFP allows states to make more than 2 submissions. Now, why 2, and why not just 1? What I did is that, as I said, we had a competition basically sort of like what we're having at the federal level among the state, and asking various councils of governments around the state to help us identify what they thought would be the best site, recognizing what were sort of the major pieces of the RFP, where's coal? Do they have rail lines to rail it in? Do they have pipeline to get the hydrogen and the CO2 out? Is it in a hurricane environment? Does it have seismic conditions such that if we had an earthquake, then maybe, you might end up having a release of that CO2 that was in those in that formation that I thought would be obviously enormously safe. So there's a whole range of obviously criteria that we have to sort of attend to. And as we went through it and using the technical expertise of the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology and looking at a range of other kinds of criteria, that's how we ended up with two. And I think what we have with the two are two very, very interesting possibilities. In West Texas, we have an area that is sort of really created where you can truly store the CO2, and there are a lot of salt formations in West Texas, exactly what's called for in the RFP. And you've got this piece for CO2 EOR where we can actually generate dollars from the use of the CO2. But that coal that's going to be used in that project out there, if it wins out there, that coal's going to have to be railed in. There is no coal in West Texas, so it's going to have to get on rail. The East Texas side gives us a very, very different opportunity. That's at the mouth of a Texas lignite mine. That is Texas coal. Most of us don't, unless we're in the energy business, didn't even know Texas had coal. It doesn't look like traditional coal. It looks more like dirt than it does coal. It's not a brick. It looks like a bucket of dirt. But it burns and it's coal. But it's at the mouth of a Texas lignite mine. And so it gives us the opportunity to put forth lignite. And across the southern part of the country, much of the coal that's across from here to Florida is lignite. It's Gulf Coast lignite. And so that may be attractive to them. So they have two very, very different kinds of proposals that they'll have an opportunity to look at and they'll make a decision as to which one, hopefully, which one of those two, as opposed to which one of the other 22 will get elected. In terms of sort of competing interests, you mean between crude and natural gas or producers, and what do you mean? I was truly surprised at how almost uniformly supportive Texans were about the prospect of FutureGen. Now, we spent a whole lot of time going back a year and a half ago, going around the state and sort of doing workshops. But in our Texas proposal, Environmental Defense Fund is part of our Texas proposal. Environmental Defense Fund sits on my advisory board that helped us figure out where to locate FutureGen. Now, we spent a whole lot of time. They supported our FutureGen legislation that the legislature passed in the last session. But uniformly, I mean, obviously coal is thought of, I think, by many folks as sort of the redheaded stepchild in the Texas energy business. It ought not be in the future, but that's probably the way it's thought of by many people. And oil and gas producers supported FutureGen. I think in large part, the ones out in the Permian Basin really like it because of the prospect is going to have to provide more supply for CO2. And natural gas producers recognize that technology is being enhanced for CO2 natural gas enhanced recovery. And so they're on board, even though it's not really, about oil and about crude. It's about the environmental issues that you raised. Well, let me first try to deal with the question with regards to alternative fuels. My own sort of research and analysis tells me that obviously nuclears have to be part of our energy mix, particularly obviously it's once the facilities are built and once they've been permitted, then obviously we can make electricity a whole lot cheaper with nukes than we can with anything else. Unfortunately, we haven't built one since the 1970s. And I think in large part because nuclear power has sort of lost the PR game. And it is probably the responsibility of policymakers like myself, as well as citizens like yourself, to continue to make the argument about the necessity for nukes. Now, as it relates to the traditional renewables and sustainables, whether they be wind and solar, I have to admit, I'm not sold yet. I admit that, much to the chagrin of the Dallas Morning News. I am not sold at the moment. But I do think that in terms of our energy mix, whether it's electricity or transportation, we need to sort of have a cafeteria line where we're going to have a little of everything. And in that way, I think wind and solar at some point in time might make sense. But today they're awfully expensive. I mean, the capital cost to build and provide us with electricity from wind and solar right now is more expensive than any of the others. And the only reason we're building them in the state is because power generators are required to do so. And other folks are subsidizing those costs. So right now I haven't gotten there. But even as it relates to biomass, which I did mention was a possibility in terms of transportation fuels, biomass right now is not the most efficient way to make transportation fuels. And so, just as we're going to have to develop new technology for wind and solar, we'll have to develop new technology for biomass. As it relates to the question in terms of the role of the commission as a policy making shop, that's what I think we see as, while the Constitution basically sort of drafts us as a regulatory body, I think all three of us recognize sort of the responsibility and the role that we have as policymakers, and that's part of why I'm here. And that's part of what FutureGen is. I mean, that's trying to sort of tell us about the direction, the new direction of what we perceive to be, the direction about where we think we ought to take the state and the country. And I think all three of us spend a fair amount of time not only talking about our regulatory responsibilities at this legislature, but talking to members of the Congress about what we see as sort of the policy needs of the country, the policy cuts that we think that we as a country ought to be making. But the role has changed traditionally. I tell folks, my good friend, former Commissioner Hance, when he was a commissioner, all he had to worry about was production. And I've got to worry about production, environmental concerns, safety concerns, as well as tomorrow. And they didn't have to worry about tomorrow as much because when they were commissioners, right there a couple blocks away at 1701 North Congress, 3 guys could set the price of crude around the world. That's not the case for today's railroad commissioners. We don't set the price of crude around the world. That's changed. That's changed considerably since the 70s. And so what we've got to do is figure out how to put the state and the country in the best position to respond to prices that are being set around the world. And part of that response is avoiding the volatility that is created by, to some extent, the issues about, as I said earlier, about concerns about peaking oil supply, the susceptibility to political issues in other parts of the world. How do we move away from that is sort of what our policy challenge is. I think in many ways the effort, let's talk about the why. I mean, sometimes, I thought you were asking me that, sometimes people ask me, why in the world are you a Republican? Which I always find to be a fairly interesting question. But I tell folks, and I firmly believe I'm a Republican because I'm black, not despite it. I mean, it was this whole range of issues that relate to what I think is a success for the African American community that I think sort of fall in line with my notions of being a Republican and my notions of being conservative. And we can sort of outline those, but that's why I am where I am. And because I am where I am, and because I think it's the right decision for me, and right decision for my family, and right decision for my larger family, I mean that larger community that is my native community, it's extremely important for me to sort of do what I think I do fairly well, and that's to champion the cause and challenge people and invite folks. And so to build that group and expand that group of African Americans that call themselves Republicans, I think that's going fairly well. But we've got some challenges. I mean, but it's going well if you just look at what's happening on the national scene right now in terms of candidates. You have an African American who now has the nomination for the United States Senate in Maryland, the current Lieutenant Governor. You have an African American who as a Hall of Fame football player that played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know him as a average long jumper on the USC track team when I was an intermediate hurdler on the USC track team, Lynn Swan, running for governor of Pennsylvania, an African American Secretary of State running for governor of Ohio, an African American running for the United States Senate in Michigan. So, I mean, right now, if you look at what's happening in terms of statewide elections, there are more African Americans running for statewide elections. I mean, the top 2 seats as Republicans than there are as Ds. But we've got some challenges. There's no doubt about it. You know, if you had heard me give a speech to African American audiences as I do, I typically say, you know, what we have to do in order to track, we don't have to change who we are. But we do have to remember some things. I mean, when we see wrongdoing, we got to say we see wrongdoing. You know, when we see something stupid, we got to say we do see something stupid. And I'll share an experience with you. It had to have been maybe five election cycles ago. And you may remember when some knuckleheads were going across the South burning churches. And at the time, I was giving advice and counsel to Republican candidates who were running against Democrat incumbents for Congress. And somebody finally burned a church outside of Dallas. And I said, you know, you might want to send out a press release to say that the burning of this church is a bad thing. You're running in an area where that congressional district is about 35% African American. And the candidate called me back and he said, well, Michael, I talked to my advisors and they said that I shouldn't do it. And I said, no, think about it again, call me back. And he called me back and he said, my advisors told me, don't do it. And two things happened about that I think is instructive. The first one was my wife and I were going to hold a fundraiser for this candidate at our home with what I would call non-traditional African-American Republican donors, black folks. And Donna said no man was going to come into her house and raise money who didn't have the sense to say the burning of a church was a bad thing. So that's the first thing that happened. Second thing that happened, you know, he had all these proposals where he wanted to talk about, you know, school vouchers and how you move mothers from welfare to work and entrepreneurship. He had all these great ideas, you know, these great initiatives on paper. And he called me and he wanted to know why African-American ministers wouldn't call him back. And I was reminded of something that Lee Atwater said years ago. He said, you know, people don't care what you know until they first know that you care. One of the things that we have to do as a party, when we see stupid stuff, is to say it's stupid. One of the things you'll probably hear me talk about at this convention is what I think is the role for us as, not Republicans, but a role as Americans in terms of Sudan. And not only in terms of our giving to humanitarian efforts and not only our praying, but, you know, on two occasions, unfortunately, I've been trying to talk to our pension fund, Texas pension fund directors for Employees Retirement Fund, as well as Teachers Retirement Fund. My parents are retired teachers. And see if we would encourage those funds to divest in companies that are doing business in Sudan. So, I mean, all of those kinds of things, I think, will inure towards us making some progress. And if we had not made progress in terms of the African-American vote, George Bush would not be president today. It's what he was able to do in moving in Ohio from 9% to 14%, what he was able to do in Florida, in sort of the same kinds of magnitude of increase in African-American votes, allowed him to be president today. And I've had a lot of fun. You probably heard me, and I'll share it with them. You probably, you know, in the last election cycle, I got to go around the country as part of a trio and going into predominantly African-American audiences. I had on one side, I had Miss America from 2003, and on the other side, I had boxing promoter Don King. I had the beauty and the beast. But if you haven't campaigned with Don, you just haven't campaigned. I mean, there's nothing like campaigning anywhere with Don King. We were in front of a train station in New York City. Don was standing in the middle of the street with 3 lanes of traffic going this way, 3 lanes of traffic going the other way, 2 American flags standing in the middle of the street. Vote for George Walker Bush. Vote for and I mean, traffic stopped. Because when you see a troll doll standing out in the middle of the street, you know, I mean, traffic just stopped. I mean, but Don was just phenomenal in campaigning for the president, and I'll do that. I think the other thing that's happening on that front is that with Michael in Maryland and Ken in Ohio and Keith in Michigan and Lynn in Pennsylvania and hopefully myself and Wallace and Dale here in Texas and other African-American statewide elected officials, that generation grew up in, or at least as products in close proximity to the civil rights movement, and understand sort of the necessity, understand sort of movement politics, and I think understand that real notion of maintaining a understandable connection with the African American community. Because I think most African American voters, the first thing they want to know from us probably isn't about clean coal. You know, well, they first want to know you're still black. And, you know, I have this phrase about saying that I think what you're seeing in this generation are folks that in many ways are fundamentally conservative but authentically black. And there's no question that they're black. And that's going to go a long way in terms of expanding the opportunities for African Americans, expanding sort of the attraction of African Americans to the Republican Party will be elected officials and African American elected officials and others who least that old canard about they've left us isn't part of what won't be as easily made. Yes, anybody?
If there are no other questions, we're going to thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.